Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Tad and Michal, of course, for organizing this. And so let me start right away. Michal's idea for the series was really interesting. She told me that on the one hand, she wants a series that would be accessible for people who have very, very little or even zero background in Talmud. But on the other hand, she told me, I don't want this to be an introduction to Talmud. I want this to be to actually make accessible what advanced scholarship in the Talmud looks like. What do people actually study when they study this in the universities? What are the questions that they are asking? What methods are they using? And I thought hard about how to do this because I didn't want to give you then, if I gave you just like a talk about my own scholarship, that is usually intended for a scholarly audience, for an audience of advanced students who have a lot of experience with the text. But on the other hand, Michal said, please, no introduction to the Talmud. So what I thought we'll do is start as much as possible from 0 to 60, as Americans say, go very fast from some of the basics to some of the more advanced questions that scholars ask about how this text came about. What is the composition of this text? What we sometimes call the problem of redaction of the Talmud. And I'm not going to present just my own scholarship, but rather try to introduce you to the work of several scholars who in the past few years have built up theories of how and methods for understanding the Talmud's composition. And at the very end, my final slide will include some references to major works and major scholars working on or have worked on this subject. So when we think about the Talmud, what is the Talmud most basically? It is a scholarly text, a massive scholarly text, one of the longest texts that survive in antiquity. From antiquity, it is composed in both Hebrew and Aramaic. We'll actually have a chance to talk about that particular feature of it later on. It's an academic text in the sense that it is chiefly a commentary. So it is structured as a commentary on the Mishnah. The Mishnah is yet an earlier rabbinic text. It's a compilation of legal teachings from the early 3rd century CE. And the Mishnah itself has a very broad range. So it discusses the full spectrum of Jewish law, from questions of blessing, agricultural law, what happens when my ox gores your ox, criminal law, sacrificial law, etc. And the Talmud goes through most, not all, of these legal teachings of the Mishnah and comments on them. And on the way, it comments also on a long list of other rabbinic teachings. Again, we'll talk about this in a bit. When I say commentary, I think that that word can be sometimes misleading for people. When I say commentary, I mean something very broad and very deep at the same time. So it is not just that the Talmud explains difficult passages in the Mishnah or explains difficult words. By commentary, that also means going deep into the reasoning behind the laws that the Mishnah presents, or trying to see how the sages of the Mishnah derive the laws from the Bible, which they don't they don't show us themselves how they do. So the Talmud has to reconstruct it, right? Explaining different laws that seem to contradict one another and generating new laws from that, new cases. So commentary is very expansive. It's also very expansive in the sense that the Talmud often goes into what might at first seem to be digressions. And there are a lot of other kinds, engagements with other kinds of knowledge in the Talmud. So sometimes it will go for pages and pages on astrology or medicine or magic or historical questions. So it sometimes almost has an encyclopedic aim, or what we would call an encyclopedic scope, though of course it's structured very different from what we consider when we consider an encyclopedia. This diversity and expansiveness is not just an expansiveness and diversity in subject matter, but also in terms of the voices that we hear. And this is where I want to get to the central topic of this talk, which is the Talmud's sources. So let me just share my screen here. and I hope you can all see. Michal, actually, may I just ask you to confirm that you're seeing the screen, if you could, on message or something. So when we look at what the Talmud is actually composed of, what do we see when we see the Talmud? You will see, of course. Perfect. Excellent, thank you. You will see, of course, the Mishnah, that base text that I've talked about, which is this compilation of legal teaching and represents the works of sages from the Tannaitic period, the first period of classical rabbinic literary production from the late 1st to the early 3rd century CE. And then we have what we call the Gemara, which is the Talmud proper. And when you look at the Gemara, you will see that it itself is composed of various kinds of sources. So one type is baraitot, literally meaning externals. Those are teachings from the Tannaitic period, but that is the same period of the Mishnah, but they are not included in the Mishnah itself. And then there are memrot, literally sayings, which are teachings from the Amoraic period, 3rd to 5th century CE. Those dates are very rough, and if you want, we can talk in the Q&A about how we date these things. And there's a difference, in legal authority as well as style, and of course, the different kinds of sages that appear in them. But again, a lot of different kinds of sources from different times, also different places. So Baraitot and the Mishnah are the sages quoted in them mostly come from what is today Israel, or the Galilee especially, and whereas the Memrot are both from the Galilee, but also from different locations in Babylonia and what is now Iraq, where the Talmud will eventually be composed. So again, a huge diversity of sources. And the question is, how does this all come about? And the answer to that goes through yet a third component of the Talmud that doesn't appear yet on the screen, but I will make it appear now, which is the stam. So stam is a word that in modern Hebrew often means something like whatever, or, just, or something like that. But it really means unspecified. And it refers in this context of Talmudic composition to the anonymous discussion that appears in the Talmud. So whereas memrot and baraitot, those externals or sayings, and of course the Mishnah, those are all cited sources. The voice that is citing them, the voice that is governing the whole discussion, that is coordinating everything, is the stam. So obviously this voice is very important because it's only through that voice, it seems at least, and you'll see why that might be misleading, but it seems at least that only through that voice, only through that anonymous discussion, all of this comes about, to the degree that if we can speak about Talmud in a way that's distinct from this particular sage that is quoted in it, or that particular passage from the Mishnah that is quoted in it, the only way that we can speak about the Talmud generally is through discussion of this anonymous source, the anonymous stam. And we don't exactly know where it's from because it's anonymous. No sages are mentioned there. It's not like you can say, oh, for example, in a Baraita, Rabbi Akiva might be mentioned. Rabbi Akiva was a sage who lived in the 2nd century and thought this and that. Or in the Memrot, you will have somebody like Rabbah, right? A Babylonian sage. There's a bit of a mystery to this stam, and therefore much of the scholarship, because of all of what I'm telling you now, but the importance of the stam to the formation of this text as a whole, a lot of the scholarship in the past 50 or so years concentrated on the relationship between those different sources of the Talmud, the sages that are quoted in it, in the Baraitot, the Tannaitic sages, and the Memrot, the Amoraic sages, as opposed to the stam. So let me give you a couple of examples of how does this work go about? How do we look at the relationship between the stam and its sources? And what are the implications of this for understanding the Talmud as a whole? Now, this is the most difficult part of giving a talk about Talmudic composition. The difficult part being choosing examples, because Talmudic, maybe some of you have heard sometimes the word the sea of Talmud, and by sea of Talmud, sometimes people mean just how vast the work is, but it's also really deep, and it's also very easy to drown in it, in the sea of Talmud, in the sense that it's the Talmudic passages, which are called sugiyot, are built layers on layers and details on details to the degree that it's sometimes very, very difficult to see the forest for the trees. But what I'm going to ask you is to do just that. So focus less on the details and let me walk you through the form of these passages. And so the first example I want to give you is an example from Tractate Rosh Hashanah. It's a tractate in the Mishnah that deals with all the obligations of the Jewish New Year. And the particular obligation that the passage in the Mishnah on which the Talmud comments here discuss is the obligation to blow the shofar. So something very familiar to most of you who have attended Jewish holidays, if you did, or even if you saw some movies about Jewish holidays, the blowing of the obligation to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. And this is how the Talmud's passage starts on this. It starts with actually an obligation on something completely different. They sent to Samuel's father, so people we don't know, right, sent to the father of Samuel, who is one of the important rabbis of the Talmud. If one was forced to eat matzah on Passover, he has fulfilled his obligation. So in this case, right, the question is about eating matzah on Passover, yet another fairly basic Jewish commandment. You have to eat the matzah bread on Passover. And the point that this particular teaching says is that even if you were forced to do that, you didn't do it on your own, right? Then you've fulfilled your obligation. The Talmud then goes on the discussion I didn't give you on like, well, who forced you? Maybe demons forced you. Maybe it was Persian Gentiles who forced you to do it. That I'm skipping. From this, we get back to the shofar. Said Rabbah, is again one of those sages of the Talmud. This means that one who blows the shofar only for song has fulfilled his obligation. So the point Rabbah is making here, right, is that even if you blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah just because you want to play music, right, you didn't intend to do this for fulfilling the mitzvah of the shofar, right, you have fulfilled your obligation because clearly, he says, based on what Samuel said, intention in these things doesn't matter. The Talmud then goes on to say, well, what Rabbah is saying is obvious, right? And this is the statement, this is obvious, is a statement that Talmud often makes. And it's a statement that is, if you want to slow down and think about it, opens the door for a lot of creative interpretation because the truth is that many people say obvious things all the time. We all say obvious things all the time, right? But if you try to say, well, what you said is obvious, let me see what the deeper meaning of what you said here now. Let me see maybe some small point you that wasn't apparent at first, right? Therefore, you can get through new interpretation. And one of the interpretations that comes up in this case is the Talmud reasons, and this is the second paragraph there in the blue color. Therefore, Rabbah thinks commandments do not require intention. So notice what happened here. And again, I want to ask you to sort of hover above the details and just look at the form. Rabbah said something based only on Rosh Hashanah. He intended to say something about blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. From this, the Talmud made a very general rule that all the commandments do not require intention. Now, I put those things in this different color because to show you something that is actually apparent in the text itself if you read it in the original. What Rabbah said and what is otherwise in white on this slide is in Hebrew, but what's in the cyan or the blue, depending on how you call this color, that's mostly in Aramaic, right? And that is one of the telltales of this anonymous discussion, the Stam. So the anonymous discussion of the Talmud derived this general rule about commandments not requiring intention from this very specific ruling that Rabbah made about Rosh Hashanah. What follows then is a full-blown discussion that actually goes on for in the English translation, it's pages and pages. In the Hebrew, it's 2 pages, but it's just because it's very, very terse. But pages and pages of discussion about this principle. Do the commandments require intention or do they not require intention? That is, can you fulfill the command? Is it enough for you to actually, just eat a matzah, whether you intended to fulfill the commandment to eat a matzah or not, right? Did you actually do it, right? And the Talmud adduces, quotes, sources upon sources, right? Again, I'm not going to go into all the details here at all, right? But source upon sources in which it says either argue that commandments need intention or not. But the thing is that when you remove those passages in Cyan, that is, when you remove what is in Aramaic, right, you will see that none of these sources in themselves actually make the argument either that the commandments need an intention, or that they do not. They just make specific rulings about specific cases. So that raises a few questions here, right? Did these sources ever intend on their own to speak with each other? Clearly, it seems not. They all just make particular rules about particular things. And did they debate the very point about the very general point about whether the commandments need intention, or did they talk about specific cases where intention is required or not? This is the sort of questions that that scholars address when they address this type of phenomena. In this case, I can tell you, we have a pretty good reason to think that this whole debate about intention or not intention is imposed by the later anonymous discussion, because this expression, commandments do not require intention, and also the opposite of it, the commandments do require intention, this kind of expression appears almost, and I'll go to this almost in a second, almost only in the anonymous discussion throughout the Talmud. So it appears several times in the Talmud, but almost exclusively in the anonymous discussion. Now, the example I've given you now is an example where the way the discussion works is the Talmud orchestrates this like many layered debate with a lot of different sources from different times. So the Tannaitic sources, the Amoraic sources teaching, but different sages. Another way that the Talmud deploys these kinds of teachings is in sources that are almost exclusively just anonymous discussion. That is, they don't cite named sages, they don't cite memot or baraitot. They just go through this very dialectical, kind of like sophisticated, sometimes hair-splitting logical debate. So in this case, right, you see at the top, and again, I'm not going to go through the details themselves, but someone finds tefillin, those things you wear on your arm or your head, and your head on the Sabbath. And the question is whether he is allowed to move them. They are on the street, they are in danger, something might happen to them. The question is whether they are allowed to move them. And the Talmud has this whole discussion about this opinion by Rabban Gamaliel, the sage in the Mishnah, who says you may remove them 2 pairs at a time. So the Talmud comments, well, what does he think? Why are you allowed just two at a time? Or how come you're allowed even 2 at a time, right? And it goes through this whole debate about like, what is the reason that Rabban Gamaliel rules the way that he does? And you can see there in the last paragraph around line 3 there in the last paragraph that you have on the screen, that he says that one of the reasons that Talmud suggests about this is whether the commandments require intention or not. So again, using this concept that doesn't exist in those sources themselves as part of this lengthy dialectical reasoning discussion. So you've already now seen 2 features of the anonymous discussion, which give the Talmud a lot of its characters, or actually even 3, let's say. One is the Stam often generalizes from particular rulings to suggest what might be the conceptual or even ideological sometimes reasoning behind those particular rulings about particular cases. Second thing that the Stam does is bring a lot of different sources to debate one another, even if they don't actually stand in conversation with one another. That is orchestrating a conversation that didn't exist in reality and making it up for the purpose of study and making a point. And a third feature is this sort of maze-like, twisting and turning kind of dialectical study that you see on this slide. And all of this introduces new ideas, new ways of thinking, to a new kind of energy to the rabbinic discussion of the law. Now, I told you a few minutes ago that this expression, the commandments require intention or the commandments don't require intention, these expressions almost only appear in the anonymous layer. And that's why we think it is a late concept that is projected back to earlier sources. But the word almost is important. We do have a case where this expression is attributed to a sage. So in this case, an Amoraic sage, this is Reish Lakish, also known as Rabbi Simeon ben Lakish. And in Psachim 114a, discussing the obligation to dip twice in the Seder, which some of you might know, Reish Lakish says, this means the commandments require intention. And then the anonymous discussion, the Stam, again in Aramaic, his Reish Lakish's teaching was in Hebrew. Then in Aramaic, the anonymous discussion goes on to explain how does he derive the fact that the commandments require intention from this obligation to dip twice. Now, you might tell me, well, doesn't that disprove the theory that you told us? If you told us that the very idea or the very debate about commandments requiring intention or not appears only in the anonymous layer, and that's why we think it's late. Here, clearly, it appears attributed to an Amoraic sage in Hebrew, and actually a relatively early Amoraic sage. Reish Lakish is relatively on the earlier side. Doesn't that disprove the theory? So now we have to talk about some different methods of how we do this kind of work. So the method I've shown you so far, when I showed you these other slides, the method was just to look at the style of the different words in the Talmud. For example, are they in Hebrew or are they in Aramaic? Are they the form of them? Are they attributed to somebody? Are they not attributed to somebody? And according to that, to make the distinction between the stam, the anonymous layer, and the attributed traditions on the other hand. But we have other methods also. One other method that we have is that there are parallel texts to the Talmud. So rabbinic texts that preserve the same teachings that the Talmud preserve, but in a different form. And the most important of these parallels is the Talmud Yerushalmi, sometimes known also as the Palestinian Talmud, which is another Talmud, the first Talmud, completed about 2 centuries before the Babylonian Talmud, the Talmud that became later on the central Talmud. Now, when we look at the Yerushalmi for this particular passage in the Mishnah, we find another teaching by Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, but that teaching is actually the specific ruling, it's not the concept. So instead of saying that because you have to dip twice, that means that the commandments require intention, as what Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says in the Babylonian Talmud. In the Talmud Yerushalmi, what Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says is, if he did not dip the first time, he must dip the second time, meaning just stating the very simple fact of the obligation, not the concept that is around it. So scholars look at this and they say, well, what is more reasonable? Is it more reasonable that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish happens to be the only sage in the Talmud who quotes this concept that otherwise we know only from the anonymous layer? And it just happens to be that in the Yerushalmi, which is earlier and which was actually completed closer to Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish's place and time, because Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish lived in the land of Israel, in the Galilee, is it more reasonable that the Talmud Yerushalmi actually preserves his original teaching or something more like his original teaching? And that teaching was then changed in Babylonian to something quite different in light of the concepts of the later Stam. It's the second possibility that is much more reasonable, right? And that brings us to a whole different set of problems. That is that the very statements that are attributed to the sages sometimes reflect later ideas developed mostly in the anonymous layer. So even though they are attributed, even though they appear in Hebrew, by comparing them to other parallels, we can see that they actually had a different form that was then changed in the Talmud. I can offer more thoughts about this in the Q&A. Now, so far we talked about just the way that the stam might surround teachings or might affect the form of a teaching. Another very common phenomenon is when the stam interpolates a teaching or a statement in the middle. So this is actually kind of a very interesting discussion. Rav Papa asked Abaye in Tractat Brachot, what's the difference between the ancient ones, that is, older rabbis than they are, and us? Because for ancient rabbis, miracles happened, and for us, miracles don't happen. And Rav Papa seems to continue his question. He says, well, if it's about learning, right, if the reason is that they were more learned than us, that can't be, because actually in the years of Rav Yehuda, they only studied one order of the Mishnah, the order of damages, but we study all 6 orders of the Mishnah. And they didn't even know stuff in this very obscure Tractat Uktzin. We have 13 sessions on Tractat Uktzin. And yet, despite the fact that we are so much learned than they are, it would be enough for Rav Yehuda to just take his shoe off and rain will fall, whereas we afflict ourselves and we cry a great cry and nobody minds us. So then Abaye answers him, the early ones would give up their lives to sanctify God's name. We would not give up our lives to sanctify God's name. Now, you will notice that in the way that we have it now, the form of the question makes this contrast between studying and other kinds of merit, right? It's like saying, oh, this isn't just about study. Study isn't the most important thing in the world. Intellectual prowess isn't the most important thing in the world. But when scholars look at something like that, they think this looks kind of suspicious. It looks kind of suspicious because, for once, usually rabbinic statements aren't so long. So you see how long this statement by Rav Papa is. This question is very, very long. That makes it already suspicious. And then we can use another tool, which is, earlier I showed you how we use parallels from other texts, but we also have another tool, which is parallels within the Talmud. And when you look at a parallel to this teaching in Tractat Ta'anit, you will see that this whole issue about the question of if it's about learning, we are more learned than them, and yet they had miracles and we didn't. This whole issue appears almost word for word in a completely different question, but with 2 completely different sages, right? In a dialogue between 2 different sages. So that shows us that at least one of those can't be original, right? It can't be that the same sage, right? Or sorry, the 2 different sages started to ask a different question, and then went word for word into this discussion about learning, right? And it just happens to be so, right? It makes much more sense that somebody put the same passage in between those two teachings. And in fact, when you remove the middle, you get a fairly natural dialogue in which the middle is not necessary. That is, you can actually pluck it out, and then you don't, and then you have a pretty reasonable conversation, in one case about miracles happening or not happening, in the other case about rain coming or not coming down. The importance of that is not, though, just to reconstruct. You can say, okay, well, now we got rid of it. We have what the original Amoraic sages said. The point of that is not just to do that, but it's also to understand what are the particular interests and the particular ideology of the people who put this text together. So if I look again at what they added here, you can see that they added again a discussion about the different merits of intellectual pursuit. So they are, on the one hand, they know that they've achieved something fantastic with all these Talmudic debate, all these Talmudic conceptualizations. They realize that there was intellectual achievement, but on the other hand, they aren't so sure about what the real value of it. Like, is it actually an achievement, or were the earlier generations who were perhaps less learned had more of an achievement because of their moral prowess or their devotion to God? So the point is that by identifying this as a later edition or an edition from a particular period, we can then chart a map of who are the people who are putting this text together and what interests them, what motivates them, what questions are they asking as they are putting this together. So all this brought about some theories for what the composers of the Stam had in mind that when they compose it, and what was their goal in composing the Stam. I will mention just a few because obviously we can't go into all of them today, but one theory was a very influential one by David Halivni, who actually coined the term Stamaim to talk about the people who composed the Stam, the people who composed the anonymous discussion. He said the Stamaim, what they got from previous generation was just these particular specific rulings. You can blow up the shofar, or you fulfill your requirement to blow up the shofar even if you didn't intend it, or you have to dip twice during the Seder. That is the only thing they received from the previous generation. But they wanted to justify these teachings, to understand their reasoning, and the reasoning wasn't preserved by the previous generation. So they composed the Stam, or the Talmud, in order to create a legal system that is not just that you don't just obey blindly, but you also follow reasonably. And that's why the Talmud has these conceptualizations and debates and generalizations. That is one theory. One reason it is not so compelling to me, at least, right, is that it ignores the Talmud Yerushalmi. The Talmud Yerushalmi is centuries before the Halivni's Stamaim, and yet the Yerushalmi itself includes a lot of these characteristics that Halivni talks about. It explains the laws, it debates about the laws. And yet Halivni's theory does have a lot of merit when we compare cases like we've seen earlier about commandments in requiring intention or not. Another theory by Shama Friedman was that the Stam does inherit some kind of skeletal structure of teachings, but it continues to develop and comment on it in innovative ways. So the teachings are preserved perhaps more or less in their form. Sometimes you also even change the form of the teaching, as we've seen with Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. But there is this constant development of the anonymous layer to as new ideas come into the academy. And this theory by Friedman was also adopted, I think, very beautifully by another scholar named Jeffrey Rubinstein. Rubinstein said, okay, well, Friedman focuses really about legal discussion, legal concepts, but you can do the same kind of work with new values. And so he documented all these different new values that the Talmud, that the Stam inserts into the discussion by adding this anonymous commentary and sometimes retelling and reshaping stories. So those are some of the main theories that were propounded in the late 20th century, early 20th century. Let me now go briefly into a couple of examples where I have taken exception to these things and why. So one example that I want to discuss with you or one phenomenon I want to discuss with you has to do with Halivni's theory of justification. So Halivni's theory is that the Stam comes to justify the different teachings that it cites by giving you reasoning to them. It actually often happens, though, that the Stam tries to undermine the teaching that it cites. So let me just give you a very brief example. We are in the realm of law of marriages, and laws of marriages are governed in part by questions of genealogy. That is, can you trust that you know that if you're a woman, that the man you are married come from a family that is permitted for you to get married according to rabbinic law? And there are these discussions in the Talmud about which cities in Babylonia have good genealogical record, right? And they say, okay, this Chavel Yama is the best of Babylonia. You can really be sure you can get married them. And in this Chavel Yama region, those towns are the splendor of Chavel Yama. You can really be sure that if you marry a woman from there, you're great. And then Rav Papa said, one of those rabbis we've actually encountered before, now foreigners intermingled in these places, so you shouldn't actually trust them. This is the teaching Rav Papa says. The anonymous discussion then comes and says, and this is not so. Rather, Rav Papa wanted to marry a woman from them, and they did not let him. So the stam here actually undermines what the teaching says and actually tells us rabbis invent laws because of their personal interests, right? Okay, one last example, not of an undermining thing, but one last example has to do with the existence of the stam itself. So for Halivni and Friedman, a theory that is essential is that the discussion always comes later than the particular rulings themselves. And if you see how it works, so if you see here on the left, right, we have teachings about a particular form of prayer. Do you rise or bow when God's name comes up in prayer? And you can see that you have these two white teachings on the left, and then this blue teaching in the middle that is the discussion, and then yet another white teaching, which is a ruling. So far, this works perfectly according to Halivni and Friedman's theory that the discussion is later and anonymous, and the specific rulings are early. But when we look at the Palestinian Talmud, the Yerushalmi, right, you can see that, and again, I don't want to go into the details here, the very same acts of the very same points that this anonymous discussion in the Babylonian Talmud makes appear attributed to earlier sages in the Yerushalmi. So actually, right, the process was not a process of adding later discussion into a structure that didn't have it, but rather changing the structure so that particular rulings appear attributed and the discussion appears anonymously. All this matters because what I would like to conclude with you with is the suggestion that actually there is a deliberate choice here, a deliberate structure that was meant to separate two functions that the sages wanted to play in the academy. On the one hand, they wanted to show that they were masters of tradition, that they knew how to preserve the teachings of the past, that they were very well versed in the traditional teachings of the past, and they could present them. But on the other hand, they also wanted to show that they could make new brilliant points, that they could make analytical discussions, that they could come up with new concepts. And so this bifurcated structure of the Talmud, attributed teachings on the one hand and anonymous discussion on the other hand, was meant to serve these two purposes and give them each a distinct space on the page, or rather in performance, because this is actually in oral performance, right? In the performance, you would know when the sage is making his own new brilliant point that he wanted you to see was his original contribution, or when he's preserving the teachings of the past. Okay, I think I've spoken so much, and now we have time for questions and answers.
Okay, so thank you, Moulie, for this presentation.
Let me stop the share.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
yeah,
I can.
Good. Thank you, Moulie. And thank you all for joining us for this lecture, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I should say that Moulie teaches at Princeton University, but the author of the book, Formation of the Talmud, called The Tradition and the Formation of the Talmud. And you're welcome to read more about his work, but he really summarized, I think, the main point that we wanted to start our series when we're talking about the Babylonian Talmud. So what is this text? We got some examples, and we talked about the main theories in research talking about what is this text meant to do, right? What is it supposed to achieve? And in order to do that, to talk about how it was created. So talking about the layers and the different functions of each layer, and especially the stam, right? This anonymous layer that you've talked a little bit about. I wanted to ask if you think about the issue of the creation of the text, right? So what do you foresee for us in scholarship, right? So we're again trying to navigate in this series of lecture between introducing the Talmud to people who might not know it otherwise, but also looking at it through the critical lens of new scholarship, right? What are we looking at? So where are we headed in scholarship? What are the questions we want to ask about this text, right? So you asked about the formation of it, you asked about the composers. What are the questions that we will deal with in the next, I don't know, 30 years? Both of us, I hope, will live through that 30 years, right? And what are the main questions we want to ask as scholar of Talmud? What's interesting? What's ahead?
So I think, I think there are several areas for thinking about future research, and I think some of your next speakers, like Chris Hayes or Shai Sekunda or Chaim Weiss, will talk about the futures of their own corners. From the purpose of the composition question, there are some really interesting future prospects. Some of them come from new technologies that we have. So as of course Michal would know this, because she is one of the she's really the avant-garde of applying new digital tools for the study of rabbinic literature. But developing these new there are these basically algorithms that allow us to do textual studies on a completely different scale than we could have done before. It's not necessarily that these softwares can do something that human beings couldn't do, but they can just do it much faster and therefore on a bigger scale. And so one of the problems we've had until now in the study of the Talmud is that each passage like that, it takes weeks to analyze. And because of that, the discussion has mostly been contained to discussion of very particular examples. And yes, of course, after many years, now the Halivni-Friedman theory has many examples, because a lot of people have been working at it for decades. But it means that if you want to come up with a new theory or change the theory in a particular way, it will take you a lot of time. So new digital tools will allow us to come up with more innovative theories faster. They will also allow us to come up with theories about the Talmud as a whole, beyond the question of a particular sugya. So what I've talked about now, I've talked about how about how elements within the same passage relate to one another, but we still know very little about how the passages relate to one another, how are whole tractates built. So that's another thing that we should do regardless of technology, but maybe also technology will help us do.
Wonderful answer, and especially the focus on I want to highlight two things from what you said. First, the focus on new technology that's come into this. Our series will look at our next talk by next week by Chris Hayes is going to talk about the content, right? The biblical law versus rabbinic law. What are the rabbis doing new? Shai Sekunda is going to talk about the context, the non-Jewish context of the Talmud and the way it interacted with the Talmud. And our last talk is going to talk about the genre of literature of the stories. But I love in your talk when you suggest that we're really just beginning to look at the smaller units and how they connect into this to make this sea of Talmud, as you called it, and using new technologies such as digital humanities and algorithm to come about realization of all those angles that we're going to cover and how they give us new tools. Can you talk about a little bit, when we talk about the non-Jewish world around this, when we talk about editing this text and creating this text, you've dealt with this in your book, and I wonder if you can raise some of this topic. Did other communities create similar texts such as us? Do looking at texts created by Christians, by Persians, by non-Jews in the world in which the rabbis lived help us better understand what we have in front of us and how it was created?
Yeah, so I think there are two sides to this question, right? On the one hand, there isn't anything quite like the Talmud in other cultures. So there isn't. It's not like that there is a Greek text or a Latin text or a Syriac text or a Persian text that like looks the same. That doesn't exactly exist, right? And that led some people to think, well, then the answer to the question that Michal just asked me is no. This is a completely unique phenomenon. And it should be studied only as a Jewish internal development. But the more we look, the more we see that there are actually a lot, that we can shed a lot of light on the process of the composition and what kind of a text it is when we look at different cultures surrounding the Talmud. So one example is, we know that the Talmud is the result of a particular academic culture. It is the product of the Jewish academies in Babylonia, and those academies rise in a particular space and time. And we also know that these academies are very similar in their structure, in their curricular terminology, in how they think about themselves to the Christian academies of the same region, which were Syriac speaking, right? So not Greek speaking Christians, but Syriac speaking Christians. And that allows us to understand much more about the academic background, which is essential for understanding the composition of the text, right? Another light comes from the Greek and Roman scholastic traditions. So
okay, so I'll stop you here in a second because we have a question from Suzanne Klingenstein. I hope I'm saying this correctly, who asks about the Roman code of law, and we have Melanie Aaron who talks about the Hadith among the Muslims. So they're actually asking you about specific code laws.
All right. So let me answer separately those two questions. So Roman law is very interesting. There are some parallels in both specific and general. So specific parallels, for example, actually I can say one of my students discovered a really interesting parallel between the guidelines for deciding disputes, right? So you have a dispute between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yosei. How do you decide where is the law, right? And there are these guidelines, and there are similar guidelines in Roman law. There's also a more general idea, which is the very ambition to collect different laws from different sides. But again, the texts do look very differently in the end. The Hadith is another interesting question where at least until now, the suggestion has been that the influence works on the other side. So Michael Cook, in a very important article on the development of the Muslim isnad, so maybe just to explain the basic terms, Hadith is built of two components. There is the matan, the teaching, and the isnad is the attribution of the teaching. The isnads are often very, very long. And Michael Cook pointed out that the isnad looks a lot like some of those attributions we have in rabbinic literature. So there definitely are shared components despite the differences.
Okay, that's wonderful. And I'll just address another question that you've been asked by Benjamin Pashkov that talked about if you can talk a little bit more about the difference between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi when we're talking about the editing and the weight composition. I'll also plug in your next project, which I'm very excited about. Moulie's writing another book that's supposed to come out and really talks about the Yerushalmi. And it also connects to some other question that we received from people such as Robert Spitzers and other in the chat that ask about the concept of oral Torah. So I know that the question is about the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, but when you're talking about the Yerushalmi and you're talking about the Jerusalem Talmud and the concept of oral Torah in general, so if you can talk a little bit about that and how that concept plays into the two Talmuds and how they compare when we're talking about the text as a whole.
Okay, I'll start with the Yerushalmi. So the Yerushalmi is a text that is similar in a lot of ways to the Bavli. That is, it also is composed of some very much the same building blocks. And I don't even mean just the kinds of building blocks. That is, it's not just that it's composed of Baraitot and Memrot and Stam like the Bavli. It's actually sometimes literally the same building blocks, but they are arranged differently. There are, however, a lot of differences. One is the Yerushalmi is much shorter. It tends much less to digressions. It seems to be less ambitious as a text. The Bavli has this ambition to justify every law, to discuss every single detail. The Yerushalmi seems to be more like, here's what we need, here are the most important things we need to know about this, and here's how to navigate them. There are other differences that are epistemological, but a difference that is very important for us for today is that the Stam in the Yerushalmi is much less distinctive than the Stam in the Bavli. So what I mean by that is that in the Bavli, very often, as we've talked about, the Stam has a very distinctive voice. It introduces a lot of new ideas and new concepts and new forms of argumentation. In the Yerushalmi, the Stam is anonymous. It is also often in Aramaic, but in terms of substance and also modes of discussion, it is pretty similar or more or less similar to the teachings are in it. There are, of course, exceptions. Let me now talk about the concept of the oral Torah. So, and how it relates to all of this. So one question is how the sages themselves understood orality and why orality was important. So we have sometimes, you would hear, especially among medieval Jewish thinkers, this idea that all of these laws have come down through this parallel revelation. In addition to the revelation of the written Torah and Mount Sinai, there was also a revelation of the oral Torah, and all these laws came down to us orally through that. That is sometimes how the classical sages speak, but not always. We do know, however, that in practice, predominantly rabbinic study of rabbinic texts was done in an oral environment. And that is very, very striking, right? Why and how can you have this massive text constantly memorized and deployed only orally? Why would you do that when these people clearly know how to read and write and are very sophisticated readers of text? They read the scripture, which is certainly written all the time. There have been a lot of interesting answers to that. One of them has to do with how do you differentiate Judaism from Christianity? So Christians begin to write books in this period, Christian books, right? And these books have a status that is increasingly important, the fathers of the church, right? And they put them right next to the scripture. Of course, even for the Christians, they don't have the same status as scripture, but they put them next to the scripture as kind of, the development of the Christian tradition. What the rabbis seem to be saying is, for us, there is a bigger difference. Scripture is scripture alone, and nothing can add to it. You can't add these Christian additions, and you can't add a New Testament. And therefore, the other things that we do add to it, they are oral. We will maintain a strict difference between them. That's one of the possibilities. Are other possibilities for how this concept came about, and why was it so successful for so long?
Wonderful. We got a few questions from people who wanted you to commit to dates. I read those questions. I said I'll leave it to the end because we need to commit to dates. So how would you date this? How do you see the tradition found in the Talmud going back to Second Temple period or earlier period? Do you believe the sources to be earlier? How do you compare the Braito that you talked about with the Mishnah? So can you give like a few sentences and an outline? How do you date the sources? And we're both smiling a little bit because this is a hotly debated topic among rabbinic scholars. There is schools of thought about that, how conservative with a small c you are to believe the sources when they quote a rabbi in a named sage. Do we actually think that he said it at the time that he lived, or we think that he lived? What we talk about the redaction of the stam and its place in changing earlier tradition? So if you can say a few words about dating.
Yeah. Let me say it like that. My rule of thumb is form is not the way that the text presents to you something doesn't tell you really anything about how to date it. That is, if a text attributes something to a very early sage, that doesn't necessarily tell you that it is by an early sage, but also contrary, right? If the text presents something by a late sage or in the anonymous text, that also doesn't mean that this teaching or idea is late, because we see all the time when we look at different parallels, different manuscripts, the attribution and the form changes all the time, right? So the same content is presented in different forms, attributed to different sages in different languages. Content shifts from Hebrew to Aramaic. So the only way to really understand what the date of a particular text is to look at the specifics of that particular text. Sometimes use non-Jewish sources as well. You really have to do this, where this is where actually Christian biblical exegesis, for example, is really important. Michal worked on this. So I will say each case it has its own date, but I do think that but from that other two general rules is, one is, even though rabbinic literature actually just gets textualized very later on, and the manuscripts are very, very late, right? They are medieval manuscripts, even though these are ancient texts. So even though it gets textualized very late, it still does, we can see that it preserves early traditions. And we know that because the sources aren't homogeneous. They contradict each other. They show different ideas. So nobody was trying. There isn't an editorial consistency that was imposed here at some point. There is a diversity in the text, and the diversity shows that they are preserving older things. On the other hand, right, that all these sources are constantly adapted and readapted and shifted in ways that introduce new ideas, that introduce new expressions, etc. And because of that, you can't be sure always. Yeah.
That was such a good and politically savvy answer. This is really a hotly debated topic. I want to give some time to a few people who wanted to ask questions in their own name. Naomi, I think you asked to ask a question. Would you like to speak, Naomi?
You're talking to me?
Yes.
No, I don't have a question, but I just wanted to come on.
Okay.
But thank you very much for the presentation, which I enjoyed greatly.
Okay. Can I ask you, if I'm going back to myself, to talk a little bit about what is this text? Why is this important, right? So I've decided to convince the Israel National Library to dedicate a series of talk about the Talmud and what it is. Right, and we have hundreds of people who signed up and listened to this, and we know that this text is important for Jews today as a performative text. Right, there are people who go by the Talmud's teaching and act by it. But if we look at it as a text that's I don't know, 1,500 years old or even older than that, how do you look at this text? Is this text meant to be a performative text or an academic, scholastic text? And how does this work if we look at it as a composition, right? We've been talking about the history of the composition and in comparison to other cultures that had similar compositional text. How does we move from that to being a text that people act upon, right? A performative text, etc. How do you see the gap between the genre of literature that we've been talking about? What was it meant to do when it was created, right? In the long history of its creation, what was it meant to do? What does it do today? What did it do through history? And is there a gap between those? And how do we work around this gap as scholars of this text, looking at it from a cultural point of view or its significance in the history of the Jewish culture? So let me say a little bit more about my question to him until Moulie joins us. So basically what I asked Moulie is to talk about the differences between who wrote this text? Is this a group of scholars sitting in a room writing about a text that's only understood for them, right? Scholastic, ivory tower, Ivy League kind of scholars sitting by themselves and writing very complex texts that only they understand and delve into. As even from the example that Moulie brought today, we could see that this is a complicated text that you need to really know your way around. So is it meant for very few people and only later became accessible to a wider audience? Or from the get-go, was it meant to serve as a text used by many people, or a text that actually formed and was a formative text to create Jewish culture to the century as it was meant to be? And I think the gap that I was trying to push Moulie, which I see is no longer with us. I hope he'll join us again. But really, this is the question I was trying to push Moulie. When we're looking at the way that this was constructed, how do we look at it? Was it really an accident of history that this text became a popular text that, millions of Jews finished by doing a daily daf, a daily page of it, and finishing the whole structure? Or was it meant to be really originally just for very, very, very few people? So I see that Moulie is asking to be reconnected. I think this is a good place. Dawn, can you let him enter again? He's asking to be let in again.
Wait, I just don't see him.
The same link? Should he push the same link?
Yeah, exactly. Can you, Moulie, if you hear me, can you raise your hand and I will have you at the very beginning of the link?
He says he's here. Oh, there we go.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. The Wi-Fi here collapsed.
We can't see you. Can you open your video, Moulie?
It tells me you can't start your video because your host has stopped it.
Okay.
How would I start answering your question? And
Yeah, I
And
think maybe let's don't bother us with the video anymore, because there might be some settings issues, and just let's start the conversation.
Okay. Moulie, go ahead.
Yeah, I apologize for this. So you're asking about the significance of this text, how this text has been used. It is true that I think the majority of people who hear about
we hear him.
It is of the religious observance of Jewish law. You do?
Yeah. Moulie, try again.
Let me try.
If it doesn't work, I think we'll stop here. But can you say it try again last time?
Yeah, just a second. Can you hear me better now?
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. Perfect. So most people who, of course, hear about this text today hear about this as a way of observing Jewish law and observing the details of Jewish law. And the Talmud has served since the early Middle Ages the highest authority for Jewish legal ruling. However, as I think the medieval Jewish sages who made that process happen, as they will be, I think, the first to recognize, it is not a very good text for using as legal authority. It never tells you what the law actually is, or not never, that's an exaggeration, but very rarely tells you what the law actually is. And it tells you all these other things and all these debates. And if you try to actually observe the law based on the Talmud, you get into a whole mess. And that is why sages who try to do this, like Maimonides, say like, okay, starting over again, we're just going to rewrite Jewish law without all these disputes, without all these academic conversations. What that means, sorry, you can't hear?
Go ahead, Moulie. Yes.
Yeah. What that means, right, is that that also opens, though, different kinds of significance for the text. Now, even in the Orthodox community, of course, this text is really studied. It's not just observed. And I think that as a text that is to be studied, it's an invitation for a really fascinating, exhilarating intellectual adventure that is that allows you a kind of agility of mind that very few texts from antiquity do. And it also just exposes you to a fascinating part of the world that otherwise you wouldn't have had. So parts of your mind and parts of your world that you wouldn't know are in this text, and that's why I think it's important.
Wonderful.
I hope that came across, Michal. Yeah.
It does. But let me just finish our talk by doing two things. First, I want to address one of the question and do it a little bit on a more personal level. And then I want to introduce our talk for next week. But let's finish with one question that I like from the audience, and I want to, oh, there you are. Moulie? Yes?
Yeah, I'm here.
With me? Okay. So one of the questions we were asked is, what did it mean to women for many, many generations where this text was not meant for them, right? This was written by men and addresses men and the obligation for men. And what did it mean for women for generation? And I want to extend it a little bit as a female studying Talmud, which is obviously not an obvious choice and new and really part of our new generation of dealing with Talmud, but also non-Jews looking at Talmud scholars who look at Jews, or non-observant Jews who don't look at the text as a text to perform, but rather as a historical text or a cultural text. So what can we say about the Talmud as such a text for audiences that not necessarily were in the mind of its composer or did not take part of it or were not meant to really relate to this text?
I mean, I think that's a good answer. I will, if I can give a plug to our journal, if that's okay. I think, so I think that it is true that for all sorts of reasons, including the fact that most of the people in this field are still trained in yeshivot, which are still exclusive for women, that is, women are not allowed in. There are, of course, today other kinds of forms for women to study Talmud, but because most of these institutions are male dominated, the field is still very unequal. And I will say that Michal and I, one of the ways that we've tried to address this is by having a journal that is explicitly meant to promote, among other things, female scholarship in Talmud. There are very important female scholars of the Talmud today. It should be said, one of them is right here. You can find other names. So for the topics that I've talked about today, Judith Hauptman, Alyssa Gray, others have written about these very topics. Next week, you have Chris Hayes. So for sure, right, it's women are have occupied very important positions in the field and still do. One thing that is important for me to say is that, look, this text was not written for anybody in the 21st century. Nobody, even whether you are a rebbe in a Hasidic court or a Lithuanian yeshiva student or a secular Israeli or an American Reform Jew, the text was not meant for any of us, and therefore it was meant. It can be used by all of us, right? It is an ancient text written to an ancient audience, but we moderns can do with it what we want.
Okay, that's a good answer, and I think I'll jump in and say that I really feel very fortunate to be part of this generation where scholars who are, the Talmud is not owned by the scholars. There's no sense of ownership. Is that the Talmud is being opened up to wider audiences, both for scholarship and for learners of the Talmud in general. And I feel this is maybe the biggest achievement of our generation by making this wonderful and exciting and fruitful and very rich text that really the basis of Jewish culture, making it much more accessible to wider audiences. Someone's asking, our journal is called Okimta, and it's publishes in both in Hebrew and in English. You're welcome to join. It's open access to all, and we really promote all kinds of different scholarship and different writers, calling for people to really expand the people who for this text to be relevant too. And so this has been a real pleasure to host Moulie here, and I want to use my time to say thank you, Moulie, for agreeing to participate and to open our series of lecture and really talk about what is this text. Next week, we'll talk about the content, meaning what the laws that are presented in this text, in this Talmud. What's the connection between what's found in the Talmud and what's found in the Bible beforehand? Is it different? Is it the same? What did the rabbis do to biblical law? And how did the rabbi imagine themselves in relation to this biblical law? You need to register for each talk. Registering for Moulie Talk does not give you access to the next lecture, so please do join us next week when we talk to Professor Christine Hayes from Yale University. And please join me in thanking Moulie by really wonderful presentation and wonderful opening lectures, raising questions about proposition of the text. And I please stay with us for a few more minutes when I give the podium back to Tad to talk about what else the National Library of Israel has to offer to us in this lecture series. Tad?
Yes, thank you very much, Moulie, for really wonderful presentation, and Michal, to you for really wonderful moderation. So thank you all for coming and joining us this evening, and see you next week.
Bye.
Thank you, Michal. Thank you, Moulie. Good night.
Goodbye. Bye.